Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Thank you so much for joining me. I truly appreciate it. I'm very excited to be covering my very favorite aspect of ufology, which is of course, as you may know, onboard UFO encounters. The title of today's episode is In Total Shock, 8 Amazing Onboard UFO Encounters. I think these are very important types of cases because they dive to the very heart of the UFO phenomenon and really hold the most answers as to who these beings are, where they come from, and why they are here. I've got all different types of humanoids for you, including not just grays, but human-looking ETs, ones that are not quite human, hairy humanoids, and more. So I've got 8 cases for you today from across the planet, including 2 from outside of the United States, including Sweden and Ukraine, and 6 from within the United States, including Alabama, Illinois, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, and Montana. So let's just get to it. We'll start with the first case, which I call Scared to Death. This is a single witness case which occurred one evening in June of 1970 in a very rural area of Geneseo, Illinois. This case is an important one, I think, not only because it involves an unusual humanoid, but because how the witness is struggling to deal with his encounter. This case was reported to the National UFO Reporting Center, New Fork, in 2010. This is more than 40 years after it occurred. The witness is anonymous, so I'll just call him Andrew. At the time of his encounter, Andrew was 11 years old and lived with his parents, grandparents, and 4 siblings on a remote farm west of Geneseo, Illinois. Their house was surrounded by forest, and in fact the closest house was a quarter-mile away. And I'll just quote Andrew directly. As he says, "One night in the summer, I became aware that I was not in bed in the basement of the house where I and my siblings slept. Rather, I was sitting on a bench in a room with one adult male who was about in his mid-20s, about 25 to 30 years of age. The room was constructed of metal, as were the benches. There was one door in the compartment, and on either side of the door were windows from which I could see a passageway going to the left and right, and it had slightly slanted inward walls turning into the ceiling of the passageway. So while Andrew was fully awake, the other man in the room seemed to be in some kind of trance. As Andrew says, the other person in the compartment with me sat on the bench to the left side of the door and completely ignored me, even when I shook him and tried to get him to look at me. He just sat on the bench with his elbows on his knees, his legs spread slightly, and leaning over with his elbows resting on his knees, not moving nor talking, with his head down, gazing downward between his legs at the floor. I stood up and walked around the compartment. I tried to open the door, but it was locked, and I got up on the bench to the right side of the door and leaned against the glass, which slanted outward, and I tried to see something beside the metal walls, but all I saw was an empty passageway. The room was lighted, but I did not see any source of light, such as a light bulb. So unable to figure out where he was or what he was doing there, Andrew decided to take some action. As Andrew says, I recall looking around and wondering what I was doing there, since I was supposed to be in bed sleeping. After I looked around the basically empty compartment, I again tried to get the adult male in the compartment with me to pay attention to me and help me understand what was happening to us. But he still just sat there. I looked up at the window and I saw a creature about 4.5 feet tall, I think. It was taller than I was at the time. It was not a gray. It was covered almost totally with a reddish, dark brown, long hair, or fur, but its face looked human-like. The thing was not wearing any clothes or had any type of equipment on it that I recall seeing. I remember then I became very afraid and was scared that the thing would come into the compartment in which I was located. But it did not pay any attention to us in the compartment. It just slowly walked by the window. I was very scared, And when I'm afraid of something or someone, I tend to attack. I jumped up onto the bench and then beat on the glass and screamed and tried to break the glass. But at the same time, I was scared to death I would break it. I kept yelling and clawing at the window while lying against it, deathly afraid that the thing would come into the compartment. I was totally amazed that all throughout this incident, the man in the compartment did not even raise his head or show any interest in anything happening. The being just kept walking by, and it was shortly thereafter that I stopped remembering anything. So the next thing Andrew knew, it was 4:30 a.m. the next morning, which was when they woke up to do the morning chores. Unsure of what had happened to him, he told nobody. As Andrew says, I never did tell my parents, or anyone else, because I was sure that they would not believe me. Additionally, I did not know the other person in that compartment with me. I have never had another incident like this that I can recall. As far as the creature that I saw there, I have never seen anything like it again until the time I watched the movie Star Wars, and that Wookiee had some resemblance to the being. 40 years after that incident, Andrew still remains conflicted about the event. As he says, the problem with this is that I am honestly not sure that I did not dream these events. To this day, I am not sure this really happened. I have told my wife about this incident several times, but I have never had the nerve to tell anyone else. I should tell you now that I will not submit to anyone trying to hypnotize me. It's clear from the eyewitness's testimony that he was deeply impacted by his encounter. This is not like a normal dream, certainly, because he still remembers it very vividly and thinks about it quite often. But is struggling to know whether or not this might have been a dream. Clearly, he thinks it might not have been, or he wouldn't have reported it to a UFO reporting center. And also, I think that it's important to note that there are many details in his account which certainly align with other UFO accounts, onboard accounts, such as his description of a low bench fixed to the wall lining the room, the indirect lighting, in particular, his description of the other man in the room with him who was in a state of catatonia, absolutely entranced and non-responsive. We see this quite a lot in other cases. So yeah, I think it's a genuine UFO event. But now let's move to the next case, which I call They Are Not Humans. This one is fairly well known in its country. It occurred on March 23rd, 1974 in Markheim, Sweden. And while this is a single witness case, it does have some really interesting evidence in terms of physiological effects, and also there are outside corroborating witnesses, which I think speak to the veracity of this case. This case comes from Hakan Blomqvist and was published in the Volume 32, Number 5, 1987 issue of Flying Saucer Review. It also appeared in the January-December 1986 issue of the AFU newsletter published by the Archives for UFO Research of Sweden. It was 5 minutes past midnight on March 23, 1974, that Gösta Hager stepped out from the parish house located at Markheim, Sweden, to get some fresh air. Without warning, he felt himself almost compelled to start walking home, but along a remote forested road, a route that he never uses. He had just passed a small cottage when a blindingly bright white light appeared from the left side of the road. It was moving at great speed, growing quickly larger, and was clearly coming straight for him. Gösta threw himself into the snowy ditch alongside the road to avoid this object, and the next thing he knew, some undetermined time later, he was standing on his front doorstep holding a handkerchief to his forehead where there was a wound. Also, his right cheek had a burn mark. Gösta's experience eventually caught the attention of UFO researchers. Sten Lindgren of the UFO Identification Group of Sweden arranged for Gösta to undergo hypnotic regression. And after 2 sessions, Gösta was able to recall what happened during the missing time. He says that as he walked along the road, this light appeared, and as he said under hypnosis, "I'm blinded." There is no light such as this. I can't describe it. I throw myself in the snow. I'm lifted straight up, trying to free myself. I can't. I'm stuck. They take me. They take me. So Gosta says that when he threw himself into the ditch, he never actually hit the ground, but was immediately sucked up into this craft. And inside he saw 4 6-foot-tall figures. He said they looked somewhat Indian in appearance. He couldn't really see their ears or hair, as they were apparently wearing hoods. They seemed to communicate, he says, using melodic tones. Almost instantly, one of them held up a small instrument. This frightened Gosta, and he began to fight with them. He lunged forward and knocked one of the beings down. The other beings immediately rushed to assist their companion, and then one of the figures held up this device against Gosta's head, causing him, he says, an intense burning pain. Gosta was asked while under hypnosis to describe this instrument that the ETs used on him, and he replied, quote, "I'm not allowed to say that, no." When the hypnotherapist asked again, Gosta replied, "I'm not allowed to tell you." Now Gosta did say that the ETs never threatened him, but they did tell him not to seek medical help. At the end of his encounter, they entrusted him with some kind of mission, though Gosta would not elaborate or didn't know himself what it was. They then said that they would see him again, and the next thing he knows, they're dropping him off at the doorstep of his home, where his wife found him frantically ringing the doorbell, asking to be let in. Gosta was unable to recall any further details of his onboard encounter, but there were some strange and interesting after effects, including profound psychic abilities, inexplicable paranormal events, and an apparent healing. For example, on one occasion, Gosta was using electrostencils at his place of employment when they became completely black, which possibly indicates the presence of a strong electrical field around his body. Further investigation showed that Gosta had become very sensitive to various kinds of radiation. For example, he could sense the presence of a large rock crystal, even at a distance of several hundred meters. He says he could sense them because he felt a tingling sensation where the wound had been on his forehead. Gosta also had premonitions of when a UFO would be in the area. Most amazing, prior to this incident, Gosta had suffered from farsightedness and needed eyeglasses to see correctly, but following the incident, his vision was normal and he was able to discard his glasses. It is important to note that Gosta was blind in one eye, having fallen down from a tree as a child, and he said that following this accident, he also had some ESP and precognition. So apparently his psychic abilities have been a lifelong thing. Now, in support of Gosta's experience is a case that happened the very next day, March 24th, in virtually the same area. Just a few miles from where Gosta had his experience, a lady by the name of Hillevi Anderson and her 3 children were driving from Lindholmen to Orkesta to visit her parents when they said they saw a huge glowing object move behind some trees. Arriving at her parents' house a short distance away, soon one of them saw the object by the house. This frightened the children, who now wanted to go home. They were all frightened, so a family member agreed to drive behind them and make sure they arrived home safely. So as the 2 cars drove down the road, the UFO returned, now flying directly over the road, directly between the 2 cars, and off into the distance. But shortly later it returned, so both cars stopped and watched as this object hovered just about 1,500 feet away and 40 feet above a field. At this point they saw a second, smaller, orange, dome-shaped object hovering nearby. So they returned into their cars and began driving home. Now both objects began to pace Hillevi's car, one on each side. The larger object was now close enough that she could see it was bell-shaped, and it began sending beams of light directly onto the car and the passengers. All were thoroughly frightened and just continued to drive home. Following the encounter, the children suffered from headaches and stomach pain, and Hillevi reported kidney pains for several days. And as she says, "It was so horrible. I wish it had never happened. I got the impression that we were checked out by someone, like a big torch that swept the area. So these were not the only encounters in this area at that time. Many people were seeing UFOs. It's a pretty unusual case, I think you'll agree. In some ways, it's fairly typical. Here we have a gentleman who had a missing time encounter, and yes, it was recalled under hypnosis. But again, the events he describes are not unique. Many people have described these kinds of events when taken on board. What's interesting to me is this appears to be a healing encounter, given that his vision was markedly improved following this event. But yeah, we have physiological evidence that seems to indicate the genuineness of this encounter, and of course the corroborating outside witnesses who saw UFO activity in this area at that time. There was a big wave of activity, and often when there are UFO waves going on, there is a much higher chance of someone reporting an onboard encounter, which is absolutely what we see in that case. So now let's move to the next one. This one is so unusual. I don't know that I've heard one like this before. This one I call No Harm Will Come to You. This one occurred on August 30, 1978, very late at night, near the Kara-Dag mountain in Ukraine. This is next to the Black Sea. Yes, it is a single witness case, but I think it's an important one because it's so unusual. This case comes from the Russian publication UFO Zone and also appeared in Albert Rosali's book Humanoid Encounters, The Others Amongst Us, 1975 to 1979. This case occurred on the shore of the Black Sea near the Kara-Dag mountain, located near the city of Planarskoye in Ukraine. The witness is known only by his first name, Sharkov. He was staying at a boarding house near the lake. It was around 2:30 a.m. on the morning of August 30, 1978. Sharkov woke up with an uncontrollable need to void his bladder. So he went outside and he was walking to the outhouse not far from the shoreline, and this is when he heard a strange rumbling sound. Looking in the direction of the sound, he now saw a rounded, sort of helmet-shaped object hovering some 10 to 15 feet above the water and about 350 to 400 feet offshore. He wondered briefly if it was some kind of new weapon, but he was curious enough about it that he decided to get in the water and swim towards it. So as he swam close to the craft, he could see that the water beneath the object was glowing with a kind of shiny fluorescence. He kept swimming until he was practically directly underneath this object. He could now see a glowing green circle around the perimeter of this craft, and although he saw nobody inside the object, he did have a feeling that he was being observed. He had been swimming and watching this object for almost a half an hour when he decided that it was time to go back to shore. But as soon as he made this decision, a large metallic cylinder came out from the bottom of the craft. It began to extend into the water and then moved towards Sharkov. Before he could swim away, he found himself being drawn up into the cylinder. Once inside this cylinder, the water was released back into the lake, but Sharkov was not. The cylinder then pulled back up into the craft, carrying him with it. Some minutes later, the cylinder opened, and he found himself inside what appeared to be some kind of flight room. He said that there was nothing in this room except 2 chairs in the center of the room. The room itself was brightly lit, but there was no discernible light source. But soon, Sharkov heard a soft rumbling noise, followed by a voice speaking perfect Russian. The voice said, "Do not be afraid. No harm will come to you." Sharkov saw no figures, but this voice proceeded to tell him that they knew everything about him. They said that they were extraterrestrials from another star constellation located far away in a galaxy, and as they told him this, the room became dark, and he saw what appeared to be a holographic image and diagram of the ET's star system. They told him that they were 4 ETs assigned to this ship. Again, he never saw them. They told him that they had learned how to control gravity, They said that they were not allowed to make full contact with humanity, as this would lead to confusion and ultimately possibly the destruction of humanity. Zarkov says that at one point he lost consciousness. Waking back up, he found himself still on the craft. This frightened him. He was afraid that he might be taken with the ETs permanently. And this is when they reassured him that he would be returned, as they already had a sufficient number of humans. Following this, he was gently placed back into the water, and he swam back to shore. Suddenly he saw a dazzling bright light, and looking back, the craft was now gone. He saw that it was now 4 a.m. The encounter had lasted 2 hours. A very unusual encounter, and I wonder if it was just a chance encounter, sort of an opportunistic encounter, or if there was more intention behind it, because of course the witness did say that he felt an unusual compulsion to wake up in the middle of the night. He goes outside and of course there's this UFO hovering over the lake. It was his decision to go swim out and go underneath it, so perhaps that's what encouraged the ETs to take him on board. But what's interesting to me about this case is he never saw the humanoids. He describes the interior of this UFO in very familiar terms. And by that I mean indirect lighting, virtually nothing on board the UFO, very little furniture, just a couple of chairs. The conversation he had with these guys is also quite familiar. I wonder about the other humans the ET mentioned. I would love to talk to this witness. I have definite questions about this encounter, but it's certainly an interesting addition to our catalog of onboard UFO encounters. So now let's move to the next case. I love this one. It's a multiple witness case, although only one witness came forward. This one I call We Will Not Harm You. This one occurred one evening in October 1979 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It fits under this very interesting category of people who are driving on a remote road late at night, and this is when they get picked up. This case was reported to MUFON anonymously more than 30 years after the event. At the time of his encounter, the witness had been in the United States Air Force for more than 6 years and was a licensed airframe and power plant mechanic. I've given him the pseudonym Caleb. Caleb and his friend were traveling at 70 miles per hour on Highway 190 West outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It was 7:20 p.m. one evening in October 1979, and this is when the encounter happened with no warning. As Caleb says, "We noticed a blue light to the right of us, above the trees, moving with us. It was a round saucer shape, glowing light blue, very large. Suddenly the light moved over us and we lost all electronics. As we slowed to a stop, the car began to rise up into the air and finally was inside the UFO. The bottom of it closed under us." At this point, Caleb and his friend were both terrified. As Caleb says, "Once inside, some doors opened and figures began to move towards us. While still being extremely frightened, at the same time I was kind of interested and curious about these beings and the flying craft. One figure in a gray jumpsuit approached my side of the car, and 2 figures in blue-clad suits approached my friend's side of the car. I was getting this audible message from the one that approached me that they weren't going to harm us. He was saying, almost telepathically, 'Do not be afraid. We will not harm you.' At this point I began to calm down. My friend was extremely excited and was shouting and cursing at the same time. I screamed at him to shut the F up. So at this point Caleb opened the car door and stepped out. He did not provide any description of the beings. Presumably they are grays. He immediately began asking questions of the ETs, such as, 'What is going on? Why do you want us? How does this thing fly? Can I see the rest of it?' As Caleb says, the figure that approached me led me away from the car and toward a door. I looked back at my friend. The 2 figures were laying him in a propped position on the seat, and he was apparently asleep. To make a long story short, I made the tour of the ship and talked with these beings for a while. At one point I remember getting hold of a book that had different colored pages in it and asking if I could keep it. They told me I could. but later took it back before releasing us. When released, I was given a warning to share and give to the people of our nation. The beings on the ship told me that they have been watching our planet for many years. They stated that, in that time, they realized that we are a warlike world and have pursued more and bigger and more destructive weapons of war. They further stated that they had contacted all the governments of the world and tried to warn them and persuade them of an alternate direction, but to no avail. At that time, they had also realized that ultimately the governments were controlled by the people, and as such, for this reason, since our governments weren't listening, they were picking up people from all walks of life to give this message to in hopes that a terrible tragedy could be prevented. Now, per Caleb, the entire encounter lasted about 4 hours, and before returning Caleb and his friend, the ETs left Caleb with one final dire warning. They asked him if he knew what a quasar was. Caleb reported that he did. A quasar is, of course, as far as we know, a singularity, a supermassive black hole found at the center of galaxies with extreme gravitation that consumes celestial objects and emits them as radiation. So the ETs seemed surprised by Caleb's knowledge of this and then gave him the final warning. As Caleb says, "This is when they gave me the reason for my ride. They said that if our nations pursue this warlike attitude and use their ultimate weapons that we have developed, that we would destroy this planet. In doing this, it would trigger a quasar that which in turn would destroy their planet. And they also said that before they would let this happen, they would destroy mankind." This encounter caught my attention for a number of reasons. One is that there are multiple witnesses, even though only one came forward. But I thought it was super interesting that this witness has such a sterling resume and is clearly a very intelligent man. And also, I thought it was interesting that he had very little fear. And when that happens, people are often given a tour of the craft and have a long conversation with these ETs, which is precisely what happened in his case. Clearly, there's a lot more to this case than he's described. I would love to talk to him, and I'm betting there's enough information in this case that you could write a whole book about it. Unfortunately, he revealed only some of these encounters. But super interesting in the fact that he was given this message for all humanity. And that's the kind of message ETs give over and over again about the dangers of war and aggression, and that appears to be the purpose of this encounter. So definitely an important case. Now let's move to the next one. I call this one, "They Were Asking My Permission." This one occurred on February 3rd, 1983 in Mobile, Alabama. Now I did cover this case before, but I recently found out that there was a lot more to it, and that following this encounter, or perhaps during it, the woman was taken on board and experienced some very interesting sequences of events on board this UFO. So I'm covering it again with a lot more detail. This case comes from the volume 32, number 2 issue of the APRO Bulletin in an article titled "Encounter in Alabama." The main witness is Pat Norris. This is a pseudonym. Following her encounter, she contacted Newfork, the National UFO Reporting Center, who referred the case to APRO. At the time of her encounter, she was 28 years old and lived with her husband and children in Mobile, Alabama. On the night of February 3rd, 1983, she was visiting a friend in Mobile. After visiting, she drove home along Highway 90. Shortly after turning off the highway and heading towards her home, she heard a strange explosion, and her car began to vibrate strangely. And it was strong enough that she had difficulty steering. So she pulled over and stepped outside to check the car, but noticed nothing wrong. She continued driving, and she now saw that the woods ahead of her were all lit up with an eerie light. She figured that there might be some sort of helicopter searching for somebody. She stopped the car, looked up, and saw an enormous object about a half-mile to the west, where there was a large gravel and clay pit. She said this object was huge, about 7 to 8 stories high, about 80 feet, and more than 200 feet wide. She could now hear a high-pitched sound and saw that the wind was whipping the trees around. The object was moving slowly closer, and as it came up to her, she said all sound stopped. And Pat, who had been quite frightened, now suddenly felt no fear at all. She got out of the car and observed this object, and she said that she felt like a child with, quote, unbelievable happiness. So entranced, she looked up at the top deck where there were long windows, more than 50 feet long, she estimates, and she saw about 30 people walking about as if changing shifts. They showed no sign of noticing her, did not look out at her. She could see them pretty clearly. She said they were very pale and dressed in white one-piece suits. They were of normal height, about 5'10", she estimates, very slender, with large chests, prominent foreheads, no hair. She did notice that they moved with incredible grace. She could also see the inside of the craft, which looked sterile white with curved walls. Below the top deck, she saw another window that looked opaque or tinted, and below the craft she saw strange tubular, rectangular equipment. She saw strange I-beams, much like ships are constructed with. The craft in some ways reminded her of a submarine, and it looked to her like it might have been constructed on Earth. The very bottom deck appeared to be an observation deck, and she saw more beings there, and these were peering down at her. She said the craft had white spotlights on the side, blue and red lights that sent beams both up and down. The light from the craft was bright enough to illuminate the ground below. So while this seems to be a close encounter of the third kind involving occupants, there are some strong indications that there's more going on here. Pat says that prior to the encounter, she had been praying to see a UFO. She had started dreaming about UFOs, but it was following this encounter that Pat began having dreams that she had been taken on board. Pat says that in her dreams, she saw thousands of lights and then suddenly found herself lying on a table inside a cold room on a ship. And I'll just let Pat describe her, quote, dream experience. As Pat says, it's like a circular bed or table. There is a cross where I am lying. I'm lying on my right side in the center of it. These people that I saw on the ship are standing around me. They are not talking, but they are communicating like telepathy. I can hear them in my head. I held up my head, kind of leaning back. There is this guy, very, very old. You can tell that he is old. He has huge, massive wrinkles on his face, and he is holding his hands in front of him. They are all standing very straight, very still. I remember several people asking me questions. What are these sensations? Are you warm? Are you cold? Are you afraid? It is like they are putting me through the phases of my emotions. I remember crying at one point. I remember being very sad, extremely happy. I remember laughing out loud. I remember I got a shiver, a body tremor. Somebody asked me, what was that sensation? I told them I was cold. This one guy just held his hand over my body. It was like instant warmth, like being in an incubator or someone putting a very warm electric blanket over you, very warm. The table seemed to radiate heat. They asked me questions about my comfort. How did I feel? And what was I thinking? So after this apparent emotional and mental examination, the beings then proceeded to examine Pat physically. They asked her to lie on her back, which she did. She had the impression that her body was being x-rayed somehow. They asked her to again lie on her side, and as Pat says, they were asking my permission if they could explore me. Pat replied, yes, as long as it is not going to harm me, and as long as I don't feel any pain. And as Pat says, it was like these 2 or 3 foot stainless steel rods. They were putting them in different points on my body, along the shoulder blades, behind the ears, along my neck, mostly around the joints, at all points on my body. The sensation was very warm, tingling. You could feel the blood going through every tiny vein. I could feel every section of my brain as this warmth increased. In every section it was different. Trauma, sadness, happiness. I could remember a scene from when I was a small child. When they were doing my chest, I could feel my heart fluttering. My whole chest seemed to be vibrating. Now, Pat believes that ultimately the next procedure involved a healing. As she says, I have always had a lot of back problems. It was like they were drawing all the pressure off that part of my back, and I haven't had any problems. After I saw the ship, I had pressure in the head above the temples. It felt like my head was swelling. After they put this thing on my head, it was like releasing or drawing all the pressure, and I didn't experience that anymore. I think this is an important case because it illustrates that a very low-level sighting often results in a UFO encounter, but more importantly, she recalled it through the dream state. And you can call this a dream if you want, but I would point out the fact that in the Betty and Barney Hill case, Betty recalled the entire onboard sequence through a series of dreams, which turned out to be just as detailed, if not more so, than her hypnotic recall. Also, speaking to the validity of this lady's onboard encounters, the fact that she was apparently healed of chronic back pain. So I think it makes that a very important and interesting case. So now let's move to the next one. This one is so fascinating. It's a very benevolent encounter involving a Native American gentleman. I call this one, "The Star People Chose Her for Me." This occurred one evening in the mid-1990s to a young Native American boy, and it occurred on a reservation in Montana. This case comes from researcher Artie Six-Killer Clark, who published it in her book, More Encounters with Star People. It took place on an Indian reservation in Montana. The main witness is a man known only by his first name, Colt. It was very hot in the summer on the reservation, and Colt had gotten into the habit of taking his sleeping bag onto the roof of the house and sleeping under the stars. It was one summer evening in the mid to late 1990s, date approximate, that he had a very strange encounter. Mind you, he's just 11 years old at this time. And as Colt says, "I saw a UFO circling overhead. When it reached our house, it slowed and just stayed there, suspended in the space above me. Afterwards, it flew away." Colt was amazed by this sighting, and he hoped the UFO would return the next night, but it didn't. Nor did it come the next night or the night after that. But on the fourth night, it did come back, and this time Colt was taken on board. At the time he was wearing his shorts, lying on the roof, when a white orb of light appeared. It quickly approached, turning to blue and becoming much larger. He felt no fear, just excitement as this thing was suddenly overhead, and the next thing he knew, he was inside it. As Colt says, "I was in a huge circular area, like an arena. It had a solid domed ceiling, no windows. There was nothing in the room. No chairs, nothing. Just dozens and dozens of children, all about the same age. There was a strange smell in the room, like medicine, similar to the smells in a hospital. There were 3 boys sitting in the center of the room. Everyone else was walking back and forth." So Colt saw both boys and girls, all of different ethnicities. He saw American Indians, Asians, black and white people, and more. Almost everyone appeared to be in a trance or dazed. The only ones awake like him were the boys sitting in the center of the room. Colt says then that, quote, "tall, strange men entered the room and began to pair up the boys and girls. Colt was paired with an Indian girl with long black hair and a distinctive gap in her teeth. She was wearing a lavender dress with flowers on it. They held hands as they were led to a small, cubicle-like room where one of the tall men placed instruments on their arms, which appeared to take a blood sample. And as Colt says, "The people who took us were very tall and light-skinned. They had the longest fingers I had ever seen. They were dressed in white uniforms with a bright blue patch. They told us not to be afraid, that we were helping them out. I never remember fighting them or struggling. I was happy to be there. For some reason, I accepted the aliens' authority without question." Now, Colt does say that the insignia was a circle with 3 dots in a line. That's all he really remembers. The next thing he knew, he was back on the roof of his house. Years went by, and when Colt was a senior in high school, he went to a powwow and was amazed to recognize the girl he had met on board the UFO, the girl in the lavender dress. He recognized her immediately. Her name was Charlene, so he asked her to dance and she accepted. Soon they started dating, and before they graduated from college, they had gotten engaged to be married. And it was then that Colt decided to tell Shirlene that he had seen her years earlier on board a UFO. Now she did not believe him at first, but as he described the lavender dress with flowers, she suddenly jumped up, rushed to a cedar chest, and pulled out that very dress which had been given to her by her father when she was only 10 years old. In fact, she only wore it twice. The first time was on the night of her birthday party, and the second time was at the funeral of her father who had died shortly later. After that, she packed it away. So now, needless to say, Shirlene had no choice but to believe Colt. She herself has no memory of any ET contact, but Colt says that since that experience at age 11, he has been visited by the ETs on the average of once per year. When Artie Six Killer Clark asked him what he thought the ET agenda was and why they run tests on people, Colt had an answer. As Colt says, it's part of evolution. They keep exact notes on every form of evolution on the planet, even the animals and plants. They say humans are getting bigger, but not better. From what I understand, better would be advancement in intellect and longer lifespans. They have said that we should be living longer. Instead, we are getting bigger and less intelligent, and our lifespan has stagnated. Instead of progression, we are into regression. Colt says that his encounters have had a profound impact on his life. As he says, I have had them all my life. They have always been respectful of me. They have never hurt me, and they always ask my permission when taking samples or performing experiments. I remember seeing the girl I was going to marry. I met my wife on a UFO. She was destined to be mine. The star people chose her for me. So many interesting aspects to that case. This gentleman is clearly a lifelong contactee and has been taken on board many times, but this childhood encounter was particularly impactful. So interesting that he feels no fear of these guys and that they're asking him permission. I think this is what we see actually with a lot of encounters. I know some people have a lot of fear with their encounters, but from what I understand, people do give permission to be taken on board. This is a very controversial aspect of UFO encounters, and not all people feel that way. But certainly we do see that in this case. Also interesting is how the ETs told him that we are not progressing in the way we should be, physically and mentally, which is concerning to say the least. But the most interesting aspect to me is that he was introduced to his future wife on board this UFO when he was only 11 years old. This is a feature that turns up in a number of cases. It's not super common, but I know of many cases of people who first met each other on board a UFO and then were later brought together. Quite a few contactees will surprisingly discover that their own spouse is also a contactee. So there does seem to be some level of guidance going on here. Super interesting. All right, let's move to the next case, which I call In Total Shock. This is a single witness case which occurred one evening in June of 2000 in a suburban area of Owensboro, Kentucky. It's an important case for the reasons I will discuss after I present this case to you. At the time of his encounter, Scott was married with college-age kids and lived on Lookout Drive in the suburb of Owensboro, Kentucky. This is a city of about 60,000 people. Prior to his encounter, he had developed an interest in astronomy. So he bought a new telescope to observe the moon and various planets. It was around the year 2000, this date is approximate, when he learned that the ISS, the International Space Station, would be visible in the night sky sometime after midnight. And he wanted to see it, so he prepared. On that night, he told his family he would be outside to view the ISS. They stayed inside watching television. He went outside, this is around June, and stood in the driveway about 15 minutes before the ISS was supposed to pass by. To his shock, he saw something else, something much more exciting. As Scott says, after 5 or 10 minutes of looking, I looked to the east and was shocked and surprised to see some kind of spacecraft. It was enormous. It was huge. Not a typical disc-shaped saucer. Compartment after compartment joined together. It was flying low in the sky and traveling very slowly. It was so close. I could see windows and a very bright white light coming from them. While viewing this, I could make out silhouettes in front of some of the windows. It kept moving from south to north very slowly. It eventually moved out of my sight and got smaller and smaller as it kept on its course to the north. When it disappeared, I was left standing there by myself in total shock, in awe of what I had just seen. I just stood there for a couple of minutes and was very confused. I was wondering if I should tell anyone. Now, thinking that anyone he told would believe that he was crazy or making it all up, he decided not to tell anybody. He just opened the door and went back inside. And he estimates that he was outside for about 15 or 20 minutes. He went into the kitchen to get a soda. His kids shouted out, "Did you see it?" He answered yes, and he went back into his room and lay down. He was still in total shock. And as Scott says, I was not myself for the rest of the night. I felt numb all over and, confused, a feeling I only had that one time. I knew something happened out there, but didn't know what. So when he went to bed, he lay awake for most of the night, finally falling asleep just before dawn. The next morning he scanned the news, hoping that somebody else had seen what he saw, but of course there was nothing. And as Scott says, I began to question everything that happened that night. How could I be the only one who saw this? So I just put it to rest and vowed to myself never to tell anyone for fear of being accused of making the whole story up or looked upon as crazy. So this sighting became his deep, dark secret, and while he told nobody else about it, he couldn't stop thinking about it himself. As Scott says, for many years after that, I ran the story over and over in my mind, trying to make some kind of sense out of it, but never could. Then, one evening in 2019, he once again began to think about this sighting, but this time he remembered something else, something totally shocking. As Scott says, I was thinking about what happened that night, like I had hundreds of times before. This time it was different. I was going through the events that happened that night, but there was something else inserted into my memory besides me going out, seeing the craft, then going back in. I saw myself lying on what looked like a stainless steel stretcher inside a room, with alien greys around me, to my left and to my right. I was fully clothed and not tied or harnessed to the table in any way. There was a gray that looked like he was in charge on an elevated chair a few feet from the bottom of the table. The gray in the chair seemed to be giving the grays around me some sort of instructions or directions. He made no sound, but was gesturing with his arms. As they looked down at me, they would turn and look at him as though waiting for further instructions. I remember there were no levers or buttons or light or anything like that on the counter at my head. Everything was very plain. No tools or instruments of any kind. I wasn't complaining or objecting in any way. No one said a single word, but I knew they were communicating in some way. At this point, Scott's memory ends. More may have occurred, but this was all he could recall. And as Scott says, as soon as I observed all this, I was back in the driveway, looking up at the sky and opening the door to go inside. I was very confused, weak, and tired. So this recall left Scott shaken and wondering if what he had remembered was actually true. As Scott says, was I abducted, or was it just a thought I had? I didn't know. I thought, was this a repressed memory or a false memory? Was it a true memory of events that happened that night? This is my true UFO story. I have absolutely nothing to gain whatsoever in telling this story. There's some really interesting patterns to this UFO encounter. Yeah, it is a single witness case, but clearly this gentleman is very intelligent. I find it interesting that he developed an interest in astronomy just prior to his encounter. We see this sort of thing. I don't think it's an accident or a coincidence that he went outside and this UFO showed up. I expect the UFO occupants knew that he was going to be outside, and that's why they showed up. And what's so interesting to me in particular about this encounter is that he saw this UFO at very low level and assumed at first it was just a sighting. I've come to learn that when someone has a very low level sighting, the chances of there being deeper levels of contact is much greater. And that many of these low level sightings are in fact onboard UFO encounters, whether the witness remembers it or not. But another super interesting aspect to this case is that the witness spontaneously recalled being taken on board some years after his encounter. I often encourage people before they undergo hypnosis to just meditate on their encounter because this can bring back memories of missing time. And that's clearly what happened in this case. So this just goes to show that hypnosis is not always necessary to recall an encounter. All right, now let's move to the next case. This one is also super fascinating. This comes from a lifelong contactee who had a very interesting encounter. This one I call We're Here to Help. This one occurred one evening in October 2010 in Bangor, Maine. The witness in this case is known only by his first name, Kevin. He reports that he has had a few onboard encounters, but this one is by far the clearest. In October 2010, Kevin was in Bangor, Maine, visiting his brother. Early one morning around 2 a.m., he left his brother's house to take a 10-minute walk to his friend's house, but he never made it. At some point during the walk, Kevin was pulled on board a craft. He doesn't remember how he got on board. He was just walking, and as Kevin says, the next thing I can remember was having my eyes closed and hearing this calm, relaxing, soothing, almost hypnotizing female voice saying, "Kevin, Kevin, it's okay, Kevin. We're here to help. It's okay. We're not going to harm you. It's okay. We're going to make you feel better." Then my eyes opened up. At first there was a blinding light, but then it went away. I could see the room, and in the room were two very tall gray aliens. Now Kevin says that the room was two-toned in color, with the top section being purple and the bottom blue. Or perhaps, he says, there was a thin line of purple light and blue light which trimmed the room, which caused these colors. There was another room which was pure white. At this point, Kevin had a short telepathic conversation. Kevin asked them, "If you aren't going to harm me, what are you going to do to me?" They replied, "We are going to help you and fix you." And as Kevin says, the next thing I remember was a gray on each side of me. They put me up against a cold metal thing, and it was moving with each of them on my sides. They brought me to a hall to the left of the white room. The hall was dark, cloudy or misty like fog. The hallway must have been 40 to 50 feet before I got to the next room. In the room, I could see a huddled formation of at least 7 to 8 tall grays. To the left was a smaller group of about 5. There was a fog or mist in the room, but at times it seemed to go away. The walls of the room were indented, not flat like ours. When entering the room, I could smell a chemical smell, something like bleach or peroxide or ammonia. They brought me to the center of the room. I remember one was so tall, he had to bend a little to look me in the eyes. Kevin says that the, quote, metal thing actually kept him in a standing position, but was apparently used to transport him into the room. As he says, the thing I was standing on moves on its own and is capable of fast speed and slanting down like a table or bed. Now at this time he felt no fear, which seemed strange to him. He noticed that at times he had trouble seeing the faces of the aliens clearly, while at other times he had no trouble seeing them. And as Kevin says, the grays were at least 7 or 8 feet tall. They had long fingers, slits for mouths, and smaller black eyes. One of them put his hand on my nose, and the other one put this small black tube up my nose, a thin 7-inch black tube. They made this noise. I remember screaming after they did that. All the time, I could hear the voice saying, "It's going to be okay. We're here to help," in a soft, calm voice, as if they were trying to relax me. But I was scared. At this point, the device which held Kevin made a loud noise and moved to a horizontal position so that he was now lying on his back. They moved him to the side of the room. Kevin now began to fight back against the ETs. As Kevin says, I began to get hostile. I remember cocking my left leg back and kicking the alien. He went against the wall and fell down. I clearly remember doing it and watching the gray fly against the wall and sliding down. The other grays quickly backed off. The next thing I remember, I was on the side of the road again. So at this point, Kevin felt confused, dazed, tired, and lost. And as he stood there trying to get his bearings, a police officer drove up slowly next to him. Kevin asked the officer where a certain street was. The cop stared at him silently for a few moments and finally just pointed. So Kevin walked on to his friend's house, and he arrived there just before 6 in the morning. The encounter had lasted about 3 or 4 hours of time. There was another weird after effect, because prior to the encounter, Kevin had a crooked nose. Following the encounter, his nose was perfectly straight. Kevin reported his case to MUFON about 1 year later, writing, quote, "There are other accounts, but this one sticks out in my head the most. Please, I need help. Ever since it happened, it has consumed my thinking completely. It is all I can think about. It took me almost a year to go outside at night. I was so petrified. I am desperately looking for help and do not know where to look." Such an interesting case. I like this case because he recalled it without the aid of hypnosis. My heart goes out to him. He clearly had a hard time with his encounter. It was quite scary for him. He jumped up and attacked one of the ETs. And it's interesting how they reacted, not in a violent way. In fact, this encounter ended up being a very healing encounter. Nevertheless, it was still difficult for him. And I blame the folks behind the UFO cover-up for this, because this subject is still on the fringe. We should have a lot of places that people can go, recourses and resources for people to deal with their experiences. And really, that's just not the case. That's one of the main reasons I do this research, because I know for a fact that there are a lot of people out there who are having these kinds of encounters, including probably a lot of you who are watching me right now. So yeah, I think that makes this encounter a very important one, because it shows how difficult it is to deal with an onboard encounter, even when with the ETs telling you everything's fine, you're not going to be harmed, and they go ahead and actually heal him. So there you go. There are 8 encounters from all over the world. You can see the amazing similarities between some of them, and of course the unique elements that appear very rarely or sometimes are completely unique. All different types of humanoids, cases coming from all over the world over a long period of time. It's clear that the similarity between these cases coming from people who don't know each other argue for the veracity of these incidents. And I can understand why some people are still struggling personally to figure out, was this a dream? What happened to me? Is this false memory? How do I deal with this? But again, this is a subject that deserves to be taken with complete seriousness, because so many people are dealing with these kinds of events. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I really want to thank you again for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. It's up to you to do it. Most of all, keep having fun. I think that's why we're here on Earth. And until next time, I will see you later.